I'm now joined via video line by Roux, Professor of Economics at the University of Stellenbosch's Business School. But as well, I also have Chartered Accountant and columnist Khaya Sithole. Good afternoon to both of you. Thank you very much for your time. Somewhere during his speech, Khaya, the Finance Minister said, no finance minister wants to increase taxes. Those make you unpopular. But unfortunately, the decision had to be taken after being postponed and postponed. You will recall that initially he was going to table 2%, and at some point last week, a 0.75% number was bandied about, and today 0.5%.
Yes, it is clearly the most challenging decision for any political principle to make, to increase taxes. And I think it is particularly even more difficult in the South African context when you look at the constituencies that each of these political parties purport to represent. We are clearly suffering from being squeezed on multiple fronts. You've got high unemployment on one side, you've got a cost of living crisis on the other end. So the very idea that you can increase the cost of living through taxes is something to be frowned upon. But I think in this instance, we have indeed reached that type of position where there are very little avenues for doing something different. So in spite of the pushback and the opposition that we saw weeks ago, the minister still came out with the answer that says there has to be some medicine, there has to be some pain that must be taken, and all I can do is just manage how painful it's going to be. But this is the reality of where we find ourselves.
And Prof, he did say when he laid out the rationale for opting for VAT that, they examined various alternatives and weighed those up against the trade-offs that included increases to corporate and personal income taxes.
Yes, and just to link on to what we're talking about, John Coleman many years ago said, what the government gives, it must first take away. It's inevitable that if you want government to spend money and spend more money, you need additional revenue. And therein lies the challenge. Where do you get that additional revenue from? Of course, you could also borrow more money, but hopefully and thankfully, he was very clear on that one. He was very adamant that we do not want to see our already high levels of government debt ballooning. It's already precariously high, the interest burden is too high, we do need to bring that under control. At the same time, we want to have an economy that's growing at a faster rate. Now, I think in some ways it's unfair to expect a budget speech to create economic growth all by itself. But certainly the fact that roughly R1 trillion has been earmarked for infrastructure investment should help economic growth going forward. But going forward doesn't mean to say next year or the year thereafter. Infrastructure investment only restarts paying dividends 5-6 years down the road. In the meantime, we need to fill that gap. So mathematically, it's very easy. You either spend less money or you raise more taxes, raise more revenue, and you pick a number and go for it. But of course, politically and socially and socioeconomically, it's not that easy at all. One could go through every single kind of tax and argue for and against an increase. You're quite right. And other studies have shown in recent times, both here and abroad, that raising a corporate income tax rate from where we are at the moment might be self-defeating. It might deter investment. Raising personal income tax, well, again, the same kind of thing. However, he did, of course, and you made the point, announce that no provision will be made for fiscal drag. So effectively, we are going to pay more personal income tax, by the way. Sin taxes go up, as they always go up. Fuel levy unchanged, bit of a bonus there. And what are you left with? Well, you either have to spend less or spend your money more effectively, more efficiently as a government, and or you must give Mr. Kieswetter more money to become more efficient in collecting taxes. Failing all of that, well, it seems as if the choice fell on raising the VAT rate by 0.5 percentage point.
Yes, it did also make the point that corporate tax collections have declined over the past few years. It also made the point that corporate income tax collections are already higher than most of our peer countries. But Khaya, I'm keen to get your thoughts around the infrastructure, spending. He did detail what he has done, what they have done with regards to infrastructure spending as it relates to transport and logistics, energy infrastructure, water and sanitation and the like. And there's a point that Gwede Mantashe, the Mineral Resources Minister, made when he was speaking to one of my colleagues not too long ago, which is something that Prof alluded to just now, which is that there is a time lag between from the time money gets spent to actually getting the value or the dividends.
Yeah, it is indeed a reality of how public resource management works, in that you occasionally have to put a lot of resources that require a form of patience in order for them to pay off. So particularly in the South African context, we do know that the deterioration in public infrastructure across many dimensions has been really premised on the idea that a lot of functionaries do not think of the longer term picture. They tend to focus on the immediate needs, and therefore that's what they prioritize. In fact, in the minister's speech, he made an example, I think, of the education budget, where almost 75% of that budget goes towards paying for wages. Now, obviously, in any budgeting dimension, if you leave so little for maintenance and for building and maintaining capacity, you inevitably escalate the crisis at the point in time that you have to tackle it. And I think with perhaps the exception of the build-up towards the 2010 World Cup, South Africa hasn't really had a consensus on how big our infrastructure spend needs to be, what it needs to target, and who it needs to include in its various value chains so that we can see the ultimate benefit of it. So the fact that now government seems to have warmed up to the idea that left to their own devices, they simply don't have enough resources. So you saw many mentions of the collaborations and the participation with the private sector. That is something that has obviously been mentioned for a very long time. But I think when you had a government that has its particular ideological orientation and its fixation with this idea of the commanding heights of the economy, as the Soviets would call it, it always sounded like it was empty talk. But I think now, with perhaps the examples we've seen in the national energy crisis and some of the benefits of Bulindlela, you are essentially getting the government to be forced into working and collaborating a bit more proactively and perhaps less along the lines of its own political dogma. And that is something that we obviously have to observe over a period of time. And if we get it right, I think the upside is there to be seen.
Exactly.
Can I just add something? Add something?
Because exactly what Khaya says, that irrespective of the lapse we often see between investment and results. If you look at what has been done under Operation Vulindlela, and he cited quite a number of examples, energy reforms that have brought in 22,500 megawatt pipeline projects. He spoke about the freight logistics roadmap, which was approved. He talked about how data bundle costs have come down. He talked about water use licenses and water quality regulatory system being reinstated for the first time since 2014. In other words, saying here's evidence that even though we may have time lag issues, but eventually when you get it right, it does pay off.
Yes, absolutely. But I think we need to add something else here, another dimension, and that is, let's say you spend 100 Rand on infrastructure. Bear in mind, half or more of that might actually be used to simply repair or maintain existing infrastructure. It's not necessarily 100 Rands worth of brand new infrastructure. And that's what we're really looking for. We're looking for a net increase, and that's probably not enough. The other problem is we've seen these promises of R1 trillion. It seems to be a recurring theme over the last number of years, where various ministers announced triumphantly another R1 trillion for the next 3 years. It's not always spent. So I think there's something missing there as well in terms of almost project management. But let's not detract from the importance of the need to improve our infrastructure, and not least of which water. I mean, I'm fortunate being in Cape Town, but one reads a great deal about water quality becoming a big problem, never mind water availability. We know that as a result of our freight and railway system, a number of percentage points of economic growth have been squandered. ESCOM, the lights must stay on, whether we like it or not. So this kind of spending, this basic kind of spending is crucial, and one would hope that we're going to see a more concerted effort to make it happen, and to make it happen as quickly as possible so as to deliver the much needed dividends.
Just staying with infrastructure for a bit, Khaya. I mean, he spoke about the budget facility for infrastructure. They have reconfigured it to run multiple bid windows instead of just one annual window. Do you think that begins to address what Prof has just highlighted?
If well executed, it may well do that, because what we do realize is that obviously for any particular project that emerges, if you open it up to various role players and some emerge as the ultimate winners, there are those that have already indicated an appetite to work on something. But obviously, if that project was not it, then the question should be, well, what other alternatives are there? So the idea that you'd have to wait for an entire year for something else to be put on the table for you to evaluate was indeed quite self-defeating. So we need to see a greater sense of acceleration in getting all those projects on the ground and to get them moving, because I think one of the most interesting political dimensions that emerge from today's conversation is that the minister is essentially bought his own political party an 18-month window period in which he has to somehow simultaneously convince the voters that this was the medicine that was necessary in order for us to deal with the sickness in public resources, and also be persuasive enough to say to the same voters that you must give this party a mandate, particularly in light of the fact that it was other parties that say, wait, hold on, perhaps the pain is a bit too steep too soon. So you have to figure out how the ANC is going to play that political game of saying that, well, we want you to endorse us, but in light of the fact that actually if we had unilateral access to making this happen, we would have gone for 2%. So you kind of need to figure out how they're going to do that over the next 12 months. And I think within that 18-month window, the ANC can ill afford to dilly-dally as they've done for the past 30 years. They absolutely cannot afford to employ the same sense of lethargy, because if they do, dear God, November 2026 will be a crisis for them.
Just as a last point on infrastructure, and I'm reminded of this by what Khaya just said, Prof, was one of the other issues he raised around infrastructure was around the alternative financing arrangements. He says that they now, to support infrastructure, they have a new financing strategy, which means that a credit guarantee vehicle to mobilize private sector capital by de-risking projects. Does that take into account again? Especially the fact that, I mean, going into this budget, which Khaya mentioned, the government, I mean, the ANC's allies in the form of COSATU and the South African Communist Party did raise the issue of austerity, saying you need to spend more and more on infrastructure.
Yes. Okay, austerity is normally the opposite, but the financing, I think he mentioned briefly, I just saw briefly, issuing infrastructure bonds, which would be a good idea, a good way of raising capital. But I think the fundamental story here is, and one hopes it's not just paying lip service, is greater harmony, greater collaboration, more partnerships with the private sector. It's been shown all over the world, including other countries in Africa, that public-private partnerships are crucial in establishing infrastructure. Governments in Africa simply don't have enough resources to do it all by themselves. And one would like to see in particular, and not exclusively, but in particular, attention being paid to urban infrastructure. A few days ago, the World Bank brought out a document. Now, one can question some of what they're saying there, but a fascinating analysis is that of two fictitious gentlemen, someone working in this country earning $1,000, someone in Vietnam. And they worked out that the person working here will have to spend $500 and something per month out of $1,000 just on getting to work and back again. Whereas a gentleman in Vietnam pays something like $84 per month to get to work and back again. I mean, that alone, imagine the difference that would make, having a reliable, efficient means of transport, just getting to work and back again, never mind all the other dimensions.
Well, it did say that new regulations for public-private partnerships have actually or have now been finalized, and they will take effect on the 1st of June this year. Hopefully that then addresses that part. But I want us to talk a bit also, Khaya, about social spending with regard to health, welfare, schools, and the like, whether this a particular budget speech has given us any indication of where the government could be going next.
Well, when it comes to the social wage in South Africa, the social wage is essentially non-negotiable. So if you look at all the components of the social wage, these are the things that absolutely no government worth its salt, no political party could even consider tampering with those. What has been the big dilemma here is that with the understanding of just how important the social wage is in this country, how do you not then work towards marshalling the type of resources that will enable you to maintain it and also to obviously spread it as widely as possible? And that's been the great dilemma of the ANC's policy and economic think tanks over the past few years, in that you simply cannot balance the fact that it goes out there and says it is a party that is fully invested in the social wage. The minister even mentioned 28 million grant recipients today, and yet fails to create the type of ecosystem that enables it all to happen. In fact, quite ironically, what the ANC then does is that it actually then crowds out its own social wage spending, because by borrowing so much as we have been doing, by spending so much on non-negotiable, financial contracts where we have to pay for these loans, you are actually then diminishing the value of even that social wage dimension that you have. So it's truly extraordinary how the party fails to find that perfect outcome between its political orientation, its social orientation, and the very fact that you need the resources in order to make it happen. So whenever we look at these speeches, it's always a question of, we all know it's going to be there. It's a simple question of how you're going to fund it. In the minister's speech, yet again, he highlights the fact that the most recent, introduction to that was the social relief for distress grant, which came in during COVID-19 times. And even then, 6 years down the line, the ANC still doesn't have an answer of how it ought to be funded and how deep that funding needs to be. So what it simply does is that in every single budget that we've had since 2020, they simply say it's going to go away, but not for the next 12 months. So he says today that it's here until the next March. When we get to March next year, it will be 6 months before the local government election. So I can write that part of the speech for him already, to say we are going to keep it going again for another few months. So this simply means that it's a reiteration of a political party that simply doesn't have the capacity to take the difficult decisions. And when you don't take the difficult decisions take themselves on your behalf. So this VAT increase was simply a matter of, well, you've spent 15 years ignoring the elephant in the room. The elephant is here now. So it's 0.5% this year. It's going to be 0.5% next year. He threatened to hold back on that second 0.5% if something turns around. But come on, you looked around, the people that he was talking to, none of them have any idea what that will take. So therefore, that 0.5% of next year is going to happen.
Just to conclude, this, of course, executive statement will now go to the various select and portfolio committees in Parliament, and you're going to have all your 400 MPs so debating and discussing in all manner of forms. And just taking from what some of them had to say in reaction to the speech, you had Songezo Zibi, who chairs the SCOPA committee, saying there's a lot of wastage. They need to talk about very specific cost-saving mechanisms, like, for instance, the numbers of cars that the state in its entirety is exposed to. I saw Steve Swartz of the ACDP saying we need to talk about the bloated cabinet, we need to talk about the bailouts. Not all of that money actually goes where it is supposed to go. He spoke about corruption and the like. How do you think they're going to tackle those particular issues as they interrogate this budget with a view of either approving it or amending it?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Well, I think we're going into unknown virgin territory regarding the road ahead now. Khaya might know more about the procedural issues, but certainly everything you mentioned there's nothing new about those things. These are not new issues. They've been around for years, if not decades. Excuse me, and we can't disagree on the importance of really putting these things to bed. Whether that's politically feasible, I don't know. Time will only tell there. But I do want to mention another possible elephant in the room, and that is the civil service wage bill. I mean, I wonder how we interpret the fact that 2 or 3 years ago, the minister and his predecessor said almost categorically, although we knew it was wishful thinking, that civil service wages will be frozen. We need to stabilize that. And yet, what do we see? A 5.5% increase. We see a civil service wage bill, which is at around about 15% of the GDP, proportion of the highest in the world. Now, obviously, you can't fire civil servants, not politically. That would be politically rather immature, and not immature, but illogical. But one would like to see more focus on that. Something else that bothers me, something else I would debate or introduce into a debate, is that his forecast for economic growth this year, just shy of 2%, is, in my opinion, far too optimistic. Not, given the risk both internationally and locally. And my fear is, if it doesn't come near 1.8, and rather maybe 1.3 or 1.4, that will further erode the already limited tax base. And that will mean that organic growth in tax revenue will not be as much as he is hoping for. So I would also like to see that one debated, the feasibility of having a 1.8% growth rate. My last point, it's all very well saying we want a growing economy. Of course we do. It helps in so many ways. It helps broaden the tax base. It improves all kinds of ratios. But there seems to be an assumption in political and other circles that as long as the economy is growing, that will somehow miraculously, automatically create more jobs, which in turn will then somehow trickle down and reduce poverty and the like. We need to be aware of the fact that the economy can grow without necessarily creating jobs. So it's part of an overall economic policy, structural policy reform. It's perhaps not the minister's own area, but we do need dramatic inputs and a shake-up of the entire education and skilling system, and a reform of the labor market. To me, that's one of the most fundamental requirements, along with infrastructure.
Well, in fact, we did have that during the big years, if the unions are to be believed. They did say, well, we're having growth, or we're seeing growth, but it was jobless. Roux, Professor of Economics at University of Stellenbosch, and Chartered Accountant and columnist Khaya Sithole, thank you to both of you for agreeing to come on and enlighten us on these matters.